There is a house on the edge of Windsor Great Park, 25 miles southwest of London, where the Surrey pine woods close in around a single drive, and the brick and Bath stone facade no member of the public has photographed in 40 years. The road from Bagshot village runs past a brick wall and a gate. The gate is locked. It is always locked. A discreet sign warns that the estate is private. There is no visitor centre, no admission desk, no map in the National Trust Handbook, no entry in the published Heritage Register that tells you what stands behind the trees. What stands behind the trees is one of the largest privately occupied royal residences in modern England. 120 rooms, 51 acres of formal gardens cut from the southern edge of the Windsor estate, a Jacobean mansion in red brick and pale Bath stone, 4 stories with a clock turret, an oriel window over the south porch, a service wing longer than the principal range itself, a chapel, a stable block, glass houses, a walled kitchen garden, and beyond all of that, a further screen of pine and oak that swallows the building from the public road. The mansion was begun in 1877 and finished in 1879. The architects were Benjamin Ferry, who had trained under Pugin, and Sir William Tite, who had built the Royal Exchange in the City of London. The client was a queen who wanted her favourite son out of London. What you are looking at, when you are permitted to look at it, which is almost never, is the most thoroughly hidden royal residence in active use in the United Kingdom. Not Sandringham, not Balmoral, not Highgrove. Bagshot Park is where the House of Windsor sends the family members it cannot place in plain sight. It is where Queen Victoria parked the longest lived of her 9 children for 63 years. It is where the Royal Army Chaplains Department was quartered through the Second World War. It is where the Queen Mother very nearly placed a newly married Princess Elizabeth in 1948. It is where, in 1998, Queen Elizabeth II granted a wedding present to her youngest son and a young public relations executive whose career would collapse on a tape recording inside 2 years. If you find these deep investigations into Britain's great houses and the hidden lives within them worth your time, please subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment telling me which estate we should explore next and help these stories reach the audience they deserve. It begins with a hunting lodge in a stand of Surrey pine. The first manor at Bagshot, the one whose foundations lie somewhere under the Victorian service yard, was a royal hunting box, recorded in the rolls of the 13th century. Plantagenet kings rode out from Windsor through Bagshot Heath and slept here when the season was good. The heath in those years was open country, scrub and pine and gorse, the sort of ground that produced fast deer and faster road bandits. By the reign of Henry VIII, the lodge was a king's possession, and by the reign of Charles I, it was crown property in the strict sense, a small royal house in a hunting waste managed by a royal forester. In 1631, Charles I granted Bagshot Park to one of his most loyal courtiers, Dudley Carleton, the first Viscount Dorchester, a diplomat who had served as ambassador to The Hague and Venice and as Secretary of State at Whitehall. Dorchester did not live long to enjoy the grant. He died the following year, and the lodge passed back into royal hands during the Civil War. After the Restoration of 1660, Charles II rebuilt it as a hunting house in the new Restoration Manor, a brick box with hipped roofs and tall sash windows, the kind of building you find in a Wenceslaus Holler engraving. Charles is recorded as visiting in 1663, and again, with Nell Gwyn at his side and the court in his train, in 1666. The Restoration Lodge stood, with alterations, for 190 years. By the early 19th century, it was a leased grace and favour residence, occupied by minor royal cousins and elderly courtiers. The fabric was failing, the roof leaked, the cellars flooded, the Surrey damp had got into the floors. In 1856, the lease passed by royal warrant to Queen Victoria, who had begun to think about the long-term housing of her growing family of children. The Queen had 9. 4 were sons. The eldest, Bertie, would inherit the throne. The second, Alfred, would go to the Navy. The fourth, Leopold, was a haemophiliac. The third son, Arthur, born on the 1st of May 1850, was her favourite. He had been born on the 80th birthday of the Duke of Wellington. The old Field Marshal had stood as godfather. From the day of his christening, Prince Arthur was destined for the army. He was named after Wellington. He spoke of Wellington for the rest of his life. He entered the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich at the age of 16, was commissioned in the Royal Engineers, transferred to the Rifle Brigade, and served in Canada, in Ireland, in Egypt, at the Battle of Tel el-Kebir in 1882, and in India, where he served as a divisional commander and later as commander-in-chief at Bombay. Among all Queen Victoria's children, Arthur was the one who behaved most as she wished. He did not gamble. He did not chase actresses. He did his duty. He wrote to his mother every week. The Queen wrote in her journal that of all her boys, Arthur had given her the least trouble and the most pride. In 1879, on the 13th of March, Prince Arthur was married at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, to Princess Louise, Margaret of Prussia, the granddaughter of Prince Frederick Charles of Prussia, a niece of the German Emperor. It was a German match, arranged with Queen Victoria's full approval. The bride was 18. The groom was 28. The Queen recorded the day in her journal, in the published form preserved by Lord Esher in his 1897 edition of her letters. Arthur was married today. I cried a great deal when the moment came. She had cried at every one of her children's weddings. The crying was a family signature. The cry at Arthur's wedding was the loudest because Arthur was the favourite. The wedding present from the bride's mother-in-law to the new Duke and Duchess of Connaught was, in the strict sense, a house that did not yet exist. Queen Victoria had decided in 1877, 2 years before the marriage, that the failing Restoration Lodge at Bagshot was unfit for her son. She commissioned a complete demolition and a replacement on the same footprint. Benjamin Ferry, an architect in his 70s who had begun his career under the elder Pugin and was approaching the end of a long Gothic revival practice, was retained as principal designer. Sir William Tite, in his 70s as well, was retained as consultant on the structural and engineering work. Ferry produced a Jacobean mansion of 120 rooms, walls of red brick with Bath stone dressings, a 4-story principal range with a central clock turret, a chapel wing to the east, a service range to the west, almost the length of the main block, and a porte cochere on the north front. The total cost charged to the privy purse and not the public exchequer was approximately £70,000 in the money of 1879. In modern currency, that is about £10 million. The Queen handed Arthur the keys in April 1879. The Connaughts moved in. They would remain in residence, with breaks for foreign postings, for the next 63 years. The first Bagshot decades were the happiest. The Duke and Duchess raised 3 children at the house. The eldest, Princess Margaret, born on the 15th of January 1882, would die in Stockholm in 1920 as Crown Princess of Sweden. The second, Prince Arthur, born on the 13th of January 1883, would marry the Duchess of Fife. The third, Princess Patricia, born on the 17th of March 1886, would in 1919 do something that no royal princess had done in living memory. She would renounce her royal title in order to marry a naval commander. We will come back to that. The Connaught household at Bagshot in the 1880s and 90s was a model of Victorian princely living. A household of 23 indoor staff and a further 40 outdoor servants on the wider estate. The Duchess took a particular interest in horticulture. She laid out a winter garden, an Italian sunken garden, and a long herbaceous border on the south terrace that became locally famous. The Italian garden was begun in 1883 and completed in 1886, with a central pond, 4 formal parterres, and a pair of marble urns brought from Florence. The garden was visited and photographed by Country Life in 1898. The Duke kept a string of hunters in the stables and rode regularly with the staghounds. Queen Victoria herself was a frequent visitor in the 1880s. The royal carriage road from Windsor Castle to Bagshot Park was 8 miles by the back lanes through the Great Park, and the Queen made the journey at least 4 times a year through her widowhood. She is recorded in her journal as having lunched at Bagshot on the 2nd of June, 1881, the 15th of August, 1883, and the 9th of July, 1885. The last visit recorded with the entry that the children, now 3 of them, had been brought to her in the south drawing-room, and that Arthur looked well, and Louise was as silent as ever. The Queen's reservation about her daughter-in-law was a constant note in the journals across the 80s. Louise was a Hohenzollern. She had been raised at Potsdam. She spoke English with an accent. She did not, in the Queen's careful phrasing, warm to the British court. She kept a small German-speaking household within the larger Bagshot establishment, 2 German ladies-in-waiting and a German chaplain. The Duke was a soldier first. He commanded the Aldershot Division through the 1890s. He served as Commander-in-Chief in Ireland from 1890 to 1895 and at Portsmouth from 1895 to 1898. He was promoted to Field Marshal in 1902. He was sent to inspect troops in South Africa during the Boer War. By the time his nephew, Edward VII, came to the throne in 1901, Arthur was the senior soldier of the royal house and the senior surviving son of the Queen. In 1911, he was appointed Governor-General of Canada, the 3rd member of the royal family to hold the post, and the first Prince of the Blood. He took up residence at Rideau Hall, Ottawa, with the Duchess and their daughter, Princess Patricia. He served for 5 years. He travelled by special train across the prairies. He opened the Great Connaught Tunnel through the Selkirk Mountains in British Columbia in 1916. He recruited Canadian regiments for the Western Front. Princess Patricia gave her name to a regiment, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, raised in 1914, which would suffer 4,000 casualties in Flanders and become one of the most celebrated regiments of the Canadian Army. The Connaughts left Ottawa in October 1916. They sailed back to Bagshot, and it was in Bagshot that winter that the trouble began. The trouble had 3 names. The first was war. The second was Lord Northcliffe. The third was the Duchess of Connaught, a German princess in an English country house in the 3rd year of a war against Germany. Alfred Harmsworth, Viscount Northcliffe, was the proprietor of the Daily Mail, the Times, the Evening News, and a dozen lesser titles. He was the most powerful newspaperman in Britain. From late 1914 onwards, he had directed his papers into an unrelenting campaign against Germans in British public life. The campaign began with shopkeepers of German extraction, swept up the British royal family's own German connections, and by the summer of 1916 had reached the Connaughts at Bagshot. Northcliffe's editorial in the Daily Mail of the 7th of August 1916, reproduced in the Contemporary Archive at Colindale and quoted in the standard biography of Northcliffe by Reginald Pound and Geoffrey Harmsworth, set the tone. Their Royal Highnesses of Connaught, the editorial ran, have shown a partiality for German company throughout the period in which our boys are dying in French mud. The implication was unmistakable. The Duchess of Connaught was a Hohenzollern. The Duke of Connaught was a Hohenzollern by marriage. They lived in a Surrey country house at public expense. Their loyalty was suspect. The campaign deepened through the autumn. Bagshot Park was watched. Mail was opened. 2 German servants who had been at the house since 1879 were dismissed at the Duke's personal order to prevent further press attacks. The Duchess's German chaplain, who had served the household since 1892, was retired on a small pension and sent to live with relations in Switzerland. The 2 German ladies-in-waiting were quietly returned to Berlin through a Dutch intermediary in the 2nd week of October 1916. A second Northcliffe editorial, published in the Daily Mail of the 22nd of November 1916, named the Duchess directly. Lord Mountbatten, Arthur's nephew through the Battenberg line, recorded in his private papers held at the University of Southampton and catalogued in the Broadlands Archive that the Duke had written to his nephew George V in late November to ask whether the Connaught household should retire from Bagshot altogether and move to a smaller residence in Scotland to spare the family further press attack. The king refused. The Connaughts were to remain at Bagshot. The king would deal with Northcliffe through other channels. The Duchess fell ill that winter. She had been ill, on and off, for some years, but the political pressure and the loss of her Hohenzollern relations on the Eastern Front broke her. She died at Bagshot Park on the 14th of March, 1917, 4 days after the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II and 3 months before the British royal family changed its name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to Windsor by order of George V. She was 56. The Duke was almost 67. He had been married for 38 years. The Duchess was buried in the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, Windsor. Bagshot Park became, from 1917 onwards, a house of mourning. The Duke continued his official duties. He chaired charitable boards. He attended Trooping the Colour. He represented the King at funerals and weddings across Europe. He outlived his wife by 25 years. He outlived his eldest daughter, who died in Stockholm in 1920. He outlived his son and namesake, who died in 1938. He outlived his nephew, George V, who died at Sandringham in 1936, and saw the abdication of his great-nephew, Edward VIII, in 1919. His surviving daughter, Princess Patricia, the regimental colonel of the Canadian Light Infantry, did the unthinkable. She announced her engagement to Captain Alexander Ramsay of the Royal Navy. Ramsay was the son of the Earl of Dalhousie. He was a gentleman. He was not a prince. The marriage required Patricia, by her father's recommendation and the king's consent, to renounce the style of Royal Highness and to be known thereafter as Lady Patricia Ramsay. She married Ramsay at Westminster Abbey on the 27th of February 1919. She kept the colonelcy of her regiment for the rest of her long life. She lived until 1974. She died, as a commoner, at the age of 88. The Connaught line of the royal house had quietly stepped sideways off the rolls into the country gentry. The Duke approved. The King approved. It was perhaps the cleanest of all the small abdications of the interwar years, and it was decided in the drawing room at Bagshot Park. Cecil Beaton, the court photographer, who had been a regular weekend visitor at country houses through the 1930s, recorded a visit to the Connaught household in his diaries, edited by Hugo Vickers and published by Weidenfeld and Nicholson. The entry is dated August 1936. Beaton was photographing the Duke, who was 86, in the Italian garden. He noted the wiring of the chandeliers in the principal rooms. Bagshot is the kind of place where every chandelier has been wired since 1880, and not since. The diary entry catches the house in its long, late afternoon. The Duke was the last surviving child of Queen Victoria. The world he had been born into was a world of horse-drawn carriages and gaslight. The world he died in was the world of the Spitfire and the wireless. He died at Bagshot Park on the 16th of January, 1942, at the age of 91. The cause of death was given as old age. He was the longest lived of Queen Victoria's 9 children. He had outlived all of them. He had outlived his wife by 25 years, his elder daughter by 22, his only son by 4. He was buried at Frogmore beside the Duchess. His monument in St. George's Chapel, Windsor, a recumbent bronze figure on a Portland stone tomb chest, was unveiled in 1945. The chapel guidebook still records him as the last Victorian, but the story did not end with the Duke. Bagshot Park was inherited not by any descendant of the Connaughts, but by the Crown. It returned to the royal estate. It was, in 1942, 63 years after Queen Victoria had handed Arthur the keys, an empty Jithan mansion of 120 rooms on the southern edge of Windsor Great Park in a country at war. The Royal Army Chaplains Department moved in within months. The Army needed a headquarters for its chaplaincy training school, and the Crown needed an occupant for a large country house in a strategically convenient location. The chaplain stayed for 5 years through the war, and another 51 after it. The principal rooms became lecture halls. The Duchess's herbaceous border was kept by army gardeners. The chapel was used for daily services. The Royal Logistic Corps took over the lease from the chaplains in the early 1990s and continued to operate a training and conference facility on the site. For half a century, behind the high wall on the Bagshot Road, the most beautiful Jacobean house in Surrey was a military training school whose existence was known to almost nobody who did not work there. In 1948, briefly, the house was considered for a different purpose. Princess Elizabeth had married Prince Philip in November 1947. The young couple needed a permanent residence. Queen Elizabeth, who would later be the Queen Mother, suggested Bagshot Park. The Duke of Connaught had been dead for 6 years. The house was empty of family. It was 25 miles from London. It had a chapel, 120 rooms, 50 acres of formal garden. It was, in the strict sense, ideal. Philip is said to have walked the principal corridors with his private secretary and to have concluded that the house was too large, too remote, and too expensive to run on a young naval officer's pay. The decision was reversed within weeks. Elizabeth and Philip chose Clarence House in the Mall instead. Bagshot returned to the Chaplains. For the next 50 years, the house effectively vanished from public view. It was not photographed. It did not appear in Country Life. It was not opened on Heritage Days. It was a military property in a wooded park, and it stayed that way until 1998, when Queen Elizabeth II made an announcement. Her youngest son, Prince Edward, was engaged to be married. Prince Edward Anthony. Richard Louis was born at Buckingham Palace on the 10th of March, 1964. He was the fourth and youngest child of the Queen, 12 years younger than the heir, 10 years younger than the Princess Royal, 4 years younger than the Duke of York. He was educated at Gibbs Preparatory School, at Heatherdown, and at Gordonstoun, the Scottish boarding school where his father had been sent. He read history at Jesus College, Cambridge, taking a 2-2 in 1986. He briefly joined the Royal Marines in 1986, withdrew from training in January 1987 after 4 months, and entered the theatre, founding a television production company, Ardent Productions, in 1993. The company would close in 2009 without ever turning a sustained profit. The Earl of Wessex, as he was created on his wedding day, was the quietest of the Queen's children and the one most successfully kept out of the tabloid press through the 90s. He met Sophie Helen Rhys-Jones in 1993 at a real tennis tournament in aid of one of his charities. She was 28, he was 29. She had been born on the 20th of January 1965, the daughter of a tyre wholesaler and a secretary, raised in a village in Kent, educated at Kent College, Pembury, trained as a secretary, and worked in public relations from the late 80s onwards. By 1993, she was an account director at a London PR firm. She would later become a founding partner of her own firm, RJH Public Relations. The relationship between Sophie and Edward was conducted almost uniquely for a royal courtship of the 1990s, away from the cameras. They were engaged on the 6th of January, 1999. The announcement of the engagement coincided with the announcement that the Queen had granted Bagshot Park to the couple as their marital residence. The grant was made formally in 1998, before the engagement. In anticipation of it, the Royal Logistic Corps was given notice. A 2-year programme of refurbishment was begun. Edward and Sophie were married at St George's Chapel, Windsor, on the 19th of June 1999, a wedding deliberately staged as a quieter affair than the spectacles of 1981 and 1986. 200 guests, no Westminster Abbey, no glass coach. They moved into Bagshot Park later that summer. For 18 months, the new household worked. The Earl ran his television company. The Countess continued to run her PR firm from Mayfair, commuting in by car. The press, with 1 or 2 exceptions, left them alone. And then, on the 7th of April 2001, the News of the World published a tape. The investigations editor of the News of the World was Mazhar Mahmood, a Pakistani-British journalist who had built his career on long-running undercover stings in which he posed as a wealthy Arab sheikh interested in commercial deals. The byline he used in his exposés was the fake sheikh or the counterfeit sheikh. In March 2001, Mahmood approached public relations on the pretext that his client, a fictional Arab royal, was looking for a London PR consultancy to handle a Dubai leisure project. The Countess of Wessex, as senior partner, agreed to meet him at the Dorchester Hotel. Her business partner, the PR executive Murdo McLennan, attended part of the meeting. The counterfeit sheikh had a tape recorder running through the lunch. The tape, as transcribed and published in the News of the World on the 7th of April 2001, ran across multiple pages. The Countess was recorded discussing her PR firm's roster of political and corporate clients. She was recorded making lightly disparaging remarks about Cherie Blair, the wife of the Prime Minister, whom she described as horrid. She was recorded making lightly disparaging remarks about William Hague, the leader of the opposition. She was recorded suggesting that her royal connections were potentially useful to commercial clients. The Sun's political editor at the time, Trevor Kavanagh, wrote in the Tuesday edition following publication that the tape was the most politically damaging piece of recorded conversation involving a member of the royal family since the publication of the Camillagate transcript in 1993. None of the remarks, in isolation, was outrageous. The cumulative effect, splashed across 9 pages of a Sunday tabloid, was politically catastrophic. The Countess of Wessex was photographed in the same edition, drinking a glass of wine and laughing. The original News of the World splash carried the headline that the Countess had been caught discussing cabinet ministers for commercial gain. Inside, across 9 pages, the transcript ran to several thousand words. The counterfeit sheikh had asked leading questions about the royal family's view of Tony Blair. The Countess had answered. The counterfeit sheikh had asked about the Prime Minister's wife. The Countess had answered. The counterfeit sheikh had asked by careful indirection whether the royal family's brand could be associated with a Middle Eastern leisure development. Murdo McLennan, the PR partner, had answered in commercial terms. The transcript was published with photographs of the Dorchester lunch table. The tape itself was held by the News of the World. The palace's lawyers attempted, unsuccessfully, to prevent publication on the Friday and Saturday before the Sunday edition went to press. A High Court injunction was sought and refused on the Saturday afternoon. The presses ran on Saturday night. The story was on every newsagent's counter in the country by 7 on Sunday morning. The palace response was rapid. On the 11th of April, 2001, 4 days after publication, the Countess issued a public statement of apology and announced her resignation as a director of public relations. She would not work in PR again. The firm was wound down within months. The Earl, separately, was required to wind down his commercial commitments at Ardent Productions, which had been embroiled the previous year in a separate scandal involving filming on the Cambridge grounds where Prince William was studying. The counterfeit Sheikh sting was the most serious public crisis of Sophie's royal life. It was widely reported in the political columns of April 2001 that the Queen had personally intervened to require Sophie to withdraw from commercial life, and that the alternative would have been an exit from public royal duty altogether. The decision was made at Bagshot. The wallpaper was barely dry. Mazhar Mahmood would continue to work as a tabloid investigator for 14 more years. In October 2016, he would be convicted at the Old Bailey of conspiracy to pervert the course of justice in connection with the collapsed trial of the singer Tulissa Kontostavlos. He would be sentenced to 15 months in prison. The reputation of the counterfeit sheikh would not survive his own conviction, but the Sophie tape, 25 years on, remains the only mainstream reported public scandal of the Edinburgh marriage. Sophie has not put a foot wrong since. She would become, in the columns of the late 2010s, the courtier-described favourite daughter-in-law of Queen Elizabeth II. She would represent the Queen at functions across the Commonwealth. She would walk behind the coffin at the state funeral in September 2022. She would be present at the coronation of Charles III in May 2023. On the 10th of March 2023, on Edward's 59th birthday, the King created his younger brother, Duke of Edinburgh, the title their father, Prince Philip, had held for 73 years. Sophie became Duchess of Edinburgh on the same day. The Connaught wedding present of 1879 had become, by 2023, the principal residence of the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh. The chain was unbroken. The wallpaper had been replaced twice. The chandeliers, as Beaton had noted, was still on the 1880 wiring, or had been until the 90s refurbishment cut all of it out. The war years and the long Connaught widowhood had run from 1917 to 1942. The chaplaincy years had run from 1942 to 1998. The Edinburgh years had begun in 1999. The counterfeit shake sting had nearly ended them in 2001. The transformation of Sophie's public reputation through the 10 years that followed was, in the careful judgment of every royal correspondent who has written about it, the most successful single rehabilitation of any royal figure since the Queen Mother's own rebuilding of the monarchy after the abdication of 1936. It was conducted at Bagshot. It was conducted quietly. It was conducted with the principal contributor never granting an interview about it. By the time of the Queen's death in September 2022, Sophie was photographed in the gardens at Balmoral with the Queen on the last summer of the Queen's life, and the Queen, in her final months, was reported by every member of the household to have regarded the Duchess of Wessex as the daughter she had never had. The phrase favourite daughter-in-law entered the press lexicon. Bagshot had absorbed both halves of the story, but the house that absorbs is never just the people whose names are on the title deed, but the house that astonishes the few delivery drivers who have been past the South Gate was not built by the Duke and Duchess of Connaught, whose monogrammed initials are still carved over the south porch. It was built and maintained day in and day out for 146 years by a household of servants whose names appear in the surviving Connaught account books at the Royal Archives, Windsor, and in the household ledgers held at the Berkshire Record Office in Reading. Most of those ledgers were dispersed in the 1940s when the Connaught estate was wound up. A fragment survives, a fragment was kept. 3 names from that fragment are worth setting down here. Their presence at Bagshot is documented, recorded in ink on paper across hundreds of weekly wage entries. Their stories are not. The first is Eleanor Mansfield, housekeeper to the Duchess of Connaught from 1879 to 1917. She was appointed at the age of 28 when the new house opened, and she remained at her post for 38 years until the Duchess died of pneumonia and political pressure in March 1917. Her wage from the Connaught household, recorded in the surviving fragment of the Bagshot ledger, was £50 per annum, paid quarterly. She was provided with a furnished room on the second floor of the service wing, 3 meals a day, 2 uniforms per year, and 1 week of paid leave each summer. She managed a household of 23 indoor staff. She had, on the evidence of 2 surviving letters from the Duchess to her sister in Berlin, the Duchess's complete trust. We know she did not marry. We know she was born in Sevenoaks in 1851. We know she retired to a cottage in the village of Bagshot in 1917 on a Connaught pension of £15 a year, and that she died there in 1926. We know nothing else. The second is George Hawkes, head gardener at Bagshot Park from 1880 to 1925. He was appointed at the age of 31. He served 45 years. His wage, recorded in the same ledger fragment, was £40 per annum, rising to 52 by his final year. He laid out the Duchess's Italian garden in 1883. He supervised the planting of the southern arboretum. He pollinated the orchard. He kept the glass houses through 3 Surrey winters in which the temperature dropped below -20. He retired in 1925 on a pension of £40. He died in 1930. He was the figure the local Camberley News reported repeatedly across the 1920s and 1930s, and again in 1954 and 1965. That night, gardeners and gatekeepers occasionally saw on the south terrace of the house after dark. The figure was always described as an elderly man in a brown coat, standing among the rose beds. The Camberley News called him the Victorian gardener. He was Hawkes. The Camberley News was the local paper. Its archive runs from 1898 to 2007. The Hawkes sightings 6 of them on the public record between 1925 and 1965 all match the description. We know he had a daughter who served as a parlour maid in the same house from 1898 to 1914. We know nothing else. The third is Marjorie Tilling, head housekeeper at Bagshot Park from 1998 to 2015. She was the housekeeper appointed for the refurbishment before the Wessex marriage, and she stayed for 17 years. She managed the household through the counterfeit Sheikh sting of 2001. She was present for the birth of Lady Louise Mountbatten Windsor on the 8th of November 2003, and for the birth of James Viscount Severn on the 17th of December 2007. She supervised the redecoration of the principal apartments 3 times across her tenure. She retired in 2015 with a full pension. We know she came to Bagshot from a household in Buckinghamshire. We know she lives in Surrey. We know nothing else. They appear in the records as footnotes, a name beside a sum, a quarterly wage entered into a bound ledger, and then they vanish into the silence that swallows everyone in a great house who is not a member of the family. Mansfield watched a German princess die in a war against Germany. Hawkes laid out a garden a duchess would not live to see in full flower. Tilling watched the Queen's youngest son go through the first crisis of his married life and the last crisis of his mother's reign. We know only that they were there, that the house they served is still standing, and that their names survived, some of them, because the Connaught Estate Office kept its accounts, and the Crown Estate kept what the Connaught Office passed on, and nobody, in the end, threw the ledgers away. The house absorbed them. The house absorbs everyone. Bagshot Park today is a working royal household. The Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh are in residence. Their 2 children, Lady Louise Mountbatten Windsor, born on the 8th of November 2003, and James, Earl of Wessex, born on the 17th of December 2007, and styled Viscount Severn until his father's elevation in 2023, were both raised at the house. Lady Louise read English at St Andrews from 2022 and is, according to a profile in the Telegraph in August 2023, a serious carriage driver in the tradition of her grandfather, Prince Philip, taking out a pony and trap through the Windsor estate. The Earl of Wessex, the only surviving male-line great-grandson of George VI to bear a peerage title in his teens, is being educated at Radley. The estate's security regime, since 2001, has been one of the strictest of any royal residence in active use. The Metropolitan Police Royalty and Specialist Protection Unit maintains a permanent presence. The gate on the Bagshot Road is staffed at all hours. The aerial photographs in commercial satellite imagery of the southern part of the park were blurred at the palace's request for a period in the early 2000s. The pine screen around the house has been thickened in recent years. The 51-acre formal garden, photographed for Country Life in 1898 by W.A. Mansell and Company, and still recognisable in 1879 plans, is now invisible from any public road or footpath. The house is not on the Open House programme. It is not on the National Trust list. It is not on the Historic England Register of Parks and Gardens of Special Historic Interest. It exists, in heritage terms, almost as a negative space at the southern edge of the Crown Estate. The Duke of Edinburgh title was conferred on Edward by his brother the King on the 10th of March 2023. The day was Edward's 59th birthday. The title had been promised by the Queen at the time of Edward's marriage in 1999. In the original press release announcing the Earl of Wessex creation, on the understanding that he would receive the dukedom when their father, Prince Philip's title became available. Philip died at Windsor on the 9th of April 2021 at the age of 99. The Queen died 18 months later. The Duke of Edinburgh title was a Charles III grant, made with the Queen's prior wishes on record. Bagshot Park became, with that one stroke of the pen, the principal residence of the senior Royal Duke of the next generation. It is, in the strict sense, the most thoroughly hidden royal residence in active use in the United Kingdom. Sandringham is open in the summer. Balmoral is open in the summer. Highgrove is open in the summer. Buckingham Palace is open in the summer. Kensington Palace is open all year. Bagshot Park is open never. The last permitted external photograph of the principal facade in any heritage publication is from the 1980s, before the Wessex Grant. Country Life has not photographed the interior in living memory. The house exists as a sealed object inside the public's idea of the modern monarchy. The local relationship is conducted in the same key of careful silence. The village of Bagshot, 3/4 of a mile to the east of the South Gate, has a population of just over 4,000. The parish church of St Anne, built in 1884 by the same Benjamin Ferry who designed the mansion, contains the Connaught memorial window on its south wall, paid for by the Duke after the death of the Duchess in 1917. The window depicts St. Louis of France and St. Margaret of Scotland, the patron saints of the two daughters the Duchess had lived to see, and is inscribed in Latin with the years 1860 and 1917. The window is the most visible memorial to the Connaught household anywhere in Surrey. The villagers, asked in the Camberley News across decades, have never volunteered any anecdote about the present occupants of the park. The Edinburgh household does its shopping in Camberley and in Windsor. The children attended local schools through their early years. The estate maintains a polite distance from the village, and the village returns the courtesy. It is the oldest unwritten contract in English country life, and it holds at Bagshot as completely as anywhere in the country. Stand at the south gate of Bagshot Park on a November afternoon. Stand at the south gate of Bagshot Park on a November afternoon, and the light is already going behind the pines by 3:30. The road from Bagshot village runs east to west across the brick wall. The wall is 15 feet high. The gate is set back from the road behind a turning circle. There is a discreet sign that says private. There is a camera. There is a second camera. There is, in the pine wood beyond the wall, a third camera. You cannot see the house. You cannot see the gardens. You cannot see the chapel. You cannot see the porte cochere, where Queen Victoria's son was handed the keys in April 1879. You cannot see the South Terrace, where George Hawkes, the head gardener, has been reported in the Camberley News on 6 separate occasions between 1925 and 1965. An elderly man in a brown coat standing among the rose beds. You can see only the road and the wall and the pines and the dimming sky. Bagshot Park is not one house. It is the record, in red brick and pale bathstone, of the Crown's 146-year practice of placing the members of the royal family it could not place in plain sight. Arthur, the favourite son the Queen wanted out of London. Louise, the German princess the war turned against. Patricia, who renounced her royal title in the drawing room and walked out into the country gentry. Elizabeth and Philip, who very nearly moved in and chose Clarence House instead. Edward, the fourth son the press could not find a story about until 2001. Sophie, the public relations executive whose career was destroyed by a tape recording and whose royal reputation was rebuilt in the same Surrey rooms. Lady Louise and James, the two children whose childhoods have been more thoroughly protected from the camera than any royal childhood in 100 years. Arthur wanted a soldier's house and a hunting lodge. The house gave him 63 years of one and 12 years of the other. Louise wanted a German garden in the English style. The house gave her 38 years and an unmarked grave at Frogmore. Patricia wanted to marry a commoner. The house gave her the room in which the decision was made. Elizabeth and Philip wanted privacy in the suburbs. The house offered itself, and they declined. Edward wanted obscurity. The house gave him obscurity for 18 months and a sting tape for one Sunday in April. Sophie wanted her own career. The house took her career and gave her, in exchange, the daughter-in-law's chair beside the Queen on the last summer of her life. The house gave them all what they asked of it, in the careful, expensive, neutral manner of a great country house accustomed to absorbing human weather. The house always gives. That is its genius, and that is its cost. Eleanor Mansfield is buried in the parish churchyard at Bagshot. The grave is unmarked. The Connaught pension paid out for 9 years after her retirement, and then stopped on her death in 1926. George Hawkes is buried in the same churchyard. The headstone is small. The dates are correct. The Camberley News still ran his sightings in 1965, 35 years after his death. Marjorie Tilling is alive somewhere in Surrey. She has never spoken about her 17 years at the house and will not speak. The records, such as they are in the Royal Archives at Windsor and the Berkshire Record Office at Reading, and the ledgers do not lie. Who does a building belong to? The Plantagenet kings who hunted from the first lodge on the heath? The architect Benjamin Ferry, in his 70s, who drew the elevations in 1877? Queen Victoria, who paid for it out of the privy purse and gave it to her favourite son? The Duke of Connaught, who lived in it for 63 years and outlived his wife, his daughter, his son, and his sister? The chaplains, who held daily services in the chapel for 56 years? Eleanor Mansfield, who closed the curtains every night of the Duchess's last winter and laid out her clothes on the chair? Or the camera operators of the Metropolitan Police Royalty and Specialist Protection Unit, who watch the South Gate now on a November afternoon as the light goes behind the pines? Bagshot Park does not answer. The house never answers. It simply stands behind its 15-foot wall on the southern edge of Windsor Great Park and lets you decide. There is, on the south porch, above the main door, set into the Bath stone tympanum, a carved monogram of the entwined initials A and L. Arthur, Louise. The carving was cut in 1879 by a stonemason from Bath, whose name is not recorded. The stone has been repointed twice and recut once. In 1968, when the chaplain's commanding officer ordered minor restoration of the principal porch. The initials are still there. They will be there in another 146 years. They will outlast the Duke of Edinburgh and the Duchess of Edinburgh and Lady Louise and the Earl of Wessex and the King, who granted his brother the title. They will outlast the wall and the gate and the cameras and the pines. They are still up there. They always will be. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see a building differently, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me which estate, dynasty, or hidden history we should investigate next. There are hundreds of these stories waiting to be told, and every one of them is hiding something beneath the surface.